get that going. Been a bit, so let's try and do a quick recap as to what we've been talking about. So we're into Aristotle's metaphysics and his physics. Talk about his metaphysics for a second. Ultimately, he says if you want to understand any change, you need to understand the four causes of the change. Remember the four causes? Remember what they were? So one, we had the material cause. Let's give a concrete example and identify each of these things as we go. So let's imagine that I take some piece of marble and I turn it into a statue of Plato. So the material cause would be the marble. What material we started with, the matter we started with, to engender our change. Number two, what else can we know? The tool and who did it. So that's the efficient cause. So we have our material cause, we have our efficient cause. What else can you know about the statue idea?
Why?
You know why, so that's going to be our fourth one. That's called our final cause. That was a purpose we had in mind. And then we're missing one more.
What it is.
What it is we turn it into.
Oh, the form.
The formal cause, the form we impose upon it. The matter we start with, the form we impose upon it, how the change was actually brought about, what caused the change to occur, and then finally the purpose or the reason behind the change. Okay, got it. All right, so those were those causes. And then talking about his physics for a second. So we talked about how those causes come about in a human action. Okay, that's pretty easy to identify. But let's talk about those four causes in a living thing, for example. So you go plant some oak seed and it shoots out a root. Okay, there's something that it does. There's a change. So I'll start out with, what's the material cause? What did you start with?
Matter.
You started with the oak seed, you started with whatever water it had. Okay, what's the efficient cause? What causes that to happen? The chemistry going on, maybe the sunlight, whatever's going on there to trigger the change to occur. And then you got the formal cause. What did it change into? Oak seed that now has a root shot out. And then you have the final cause. Why is that oak shooting out that root? That oak seed shooting out that root? To grow into an oak.
Yeah.
And if we were to watch the change start to finish in any natural change, then ultimately we'd watch that oak seed turn into a full-grown oak. And so if you look at the entire change instead of breaking up piece by piece, then our material cause, once again, is still that oak seed. Our efficient cause is whatever goes into helping the oak seed grow. Our formal cause is the oak tree. And our final cause is also the oak tree. So when you look at it start to finish in natural change, the formal cause and the final cause are one and the same. Why does the acorn become an oak? To become an oak. It's actualizing itself.
Right.
Same thing with some child developing. Look at some little child and they keep growing and changing, growing and changing. Why do they grow and change into a man? To become a man. And once they develop into a man, every time you cut them and their body tries to heal itself, what does it mean to heal itself? It's somehow trying to preserve this mannish structure. Keep it going as long as it can. Now, when you're a man, you're not just a man. You're composed of things that have other causes. I'm made up of earth, Aristotle would say. And what does the earth in me want to do? It wants to fall. And so my body, me, qua man, is always working to preserve this manness, but I'm also made up of different material, different matter, and it's all trying to reach its own end. And so while my body's trying to keep me alive, if I fall from a high enough height, the earth in me wants to go down. And unfortunately for the body of me, it's going to lose that fight, and I'm no longer going to be able to preserve this manness. And the earth's going to get what's wrong. So that's why nothing can last forever, is because you're not just a man. You're a man with matter. Every living thing is that living thing, but it also has all that matter in it. And so as that tree is trying to grow, that earth is still trying to fall back down. And if it ever gets that opportunity to do it, it's going to take advantage of that. So that was his four causes. Quickly, let's recap his universe. So for Aristotle, it's just an observable fact for him, an empirical fact, that Earth wants to be at the center of everything. And that around Earth wants to be water. And that around water wants to be air. And then around air wants to be fire. And then finally, in the outermost, he had a fifth element that he talked about, ether. The four terrestrial elements, earth, water, fire, and air, or air and fire, they all move up and down naturally. That's their natural motion. We never have to explain why a rock falls. A rock falls because that's its natural motion. What needs to be explained is if it got some sideways motion. Okay, that's strange. Rocks don't magically get sideways motion. Something must have caused that motion. It doesn't have the ability to create that motion in and of itself. So that type of motion has to be explained. But when it comes to up and down, it's completely explained in terms of these elements. And based off of their density, they have their natural resting places. Earth will fall through water. On the other hand, air won't fall through water. If I take a pocket of air and take it underwater, it naturally goes up to its natural resting place, and that's where it wants to be. So that's roughly his picture of the four elements, with finally the ether. So you've got the earth at the center here, and then around the earth, you've got spheres encasing planets. So these planets may have some terrestrial element in them. There might be a lot of fire in the sun. So why does it come falling down to the earth? Because it's encased in a sphere. And so for his picture of our solar system, you've got the earth at the center, and then you've got these spheres going around it. And so your outermost sphere is a sphere of the stars. And it has an axis of rotation that it spins around the earth. So if you're standing on the earth for Aristotle, and you at the top of the earth, looking straight up at the North Star, it doesn't move. But looking at this star moves a lot, as a whole sphere orbits around you. Now, why must these things be encased in spheres? Otherwise, they must fall down or fall up. Well, most likely all going to fall down to get down to where the earth is. Because only ether wants to be up that far. Everything else wants to be down. So the actual spheres that they are embedded in are composed of ether. And then whether the stars are ether, if they're fire, I don't know. But the point is, the sphere that actually encases them is ether. And ether, unlike the four terrestrial elements, naturally wants to move in a circle. And so that's why these things spin. So those are his five elements, and that's how he explains all natural motion. Any questions about that so far? Let's see, so we talked about the spheres. Those were some of his arguments for the earth being a sphere. Remember his arguments for why the earth is a sphere? So he gave four basic arguments for why the earth is a sphere. The first one is just because it agrees with his theory. Earth, look at it, it falls towards the center. So if I had a bunch of dirt floating around and had it all fall in on itself, what's it naturally going to form? A sphere. Yeah. So, one, he agreed with his theory. Two, he noticed that when a ship's coming out from the sea, you can see the the sails before you see the hole. Third one he talked about comes from an eclipse. So you got the sun here, you got the earth here, and you got the moon here. Now they knew that an eclipse was casting the shadow of the earth on the moon, and they noticed that every time this happens, it casts a perfectly circular shadow on the moon. So either the earth is a disk floating in space that happens to be perfectly lined up with the moon, so it's always a shadow, or it's a sphere, and so it doesn't matter how the earth is oriented, it always casts a circle shadow. And then finally, what I think is his best argument, so if you look at some flat earth theory of the earth, then they got the earth something like that, and then you would have the dome of the stars, something like this. And here's the stars embedded. Here's the nighttime sky, the stars. I'm not sure how flat earthers explain the stars being out there, but whatever. Point is, if the earth is flat, then if you're right here, or right here, or right here, and you're looking this way, we'll call this way west, then you can always see the exact same stars on the horizon. On the other hand, if the earth is actually round, then if you're standing right here on the earth and you look at your horizon, then you see a different horizon than if you're standing right here and you look at your horizon. Remember, one of the things that these ancients have done very well is mapped out the night sky. That's one of the things that they mastered. And so they knew that the horizon looked different from Greece than it did down in Egypt, for example. And so that's another argument that he had for why the Earth must be round. And then he also had his arguments for why the Earth must be at the center of the universe as opposed to the sun.
Right.
Remember that one?
Yeah.
The coolest part of it is this perihelion effect. If the Earth is actually going around the sun, then when the Earth is over here, and you look at this star, then notice the circled star is going to be to the left of that gold star. And yet, when the Earth is over here, and you look at that same gold star, then the same other star will be at the right side. And you notice that we don't see this effect. Now, this effect does actually happen, but it just turns out the stars are so ridiculously far away that the effect is minuscule.
Yeah.
Impossible for you to see with the naked eye. He took that into consideration, and he thought it was just absurd to consider that the dome of the stars was just that much further out than everything else. So he thought it was more reasonable to put the Earth at the center as opposed to the sun.
Makes sense.
So that largely explains his picture of the solar system here. Now, these planets, this picture has them going in epicycles. Epicycles, that's something that a mathematician by the name of Ptolemy added later to help it match up better. Aristotle just had them going in circles, and he said, there's a problem with my theory though. Because according to my theory, Mercury should go in a more perfect, Jupiter should go in a more perfect circle around the Earth than the moon does. The further out, the more ether it should be, the more perfect your circular path should be. And he knew it was a matter of record that actually the planets' movements aren't as circular as the moon and the sun, which are definitely closer than a lot of the planets. And then by the time he gets to the stars, it's all perfectly circular again. So he says, my theory says this shouldn't be happening, but it happens. I don't know what to make of it. So Ptolemy's mathematician who comes later and says, I know what to make of it. Don't worry. You've still got nothing but circles. We're good. It's just circles while it's going in circles. And that seemed to match the empirical data at the time. And this circles going in circles is something that takes a long time to get rid of. Because even after Copernicus comes along, he says, no, actually it's the sun here at the center, so we'll pretend that's the sun and these are the planets going around. They still realize that doesn't quite match the data. And so the first thing they said is, well, maybe the planets are going in circles as they're going in circles around the sun.
Right.
And then eventually that didn't match the data. And so they said, maybe it's going in circles as it's going in circles. As it's going in circles around the sun. And they would come up with these very contrived ways of making it fit the data. And then finally, Kepler comes along and says, no guys, it's just an ellipse going around the foci of the ellipse. It's not a circle. So that circle thinking, and these things are moving in circles, is like basic fact for well over 2,000 years. Probably longer than that, well over 4,000 years. It's just accepted that that's how these things move. It must be circles. Why? Because it must be circles. What else could it be? There's something natural about a circle. And so, it's the most natural motion that there is. Okay, so I think that pretty much recaps everything we had. We talked about all that, mentioned the spheres, talked about spheres. Okay. So with this, Aristotle thought that we covered change. So it appears that in every change, there is a final cause. Notice that that was the weirdest one. Every change, there must be something before the change or something after a change, a material cause and a formal cause. We can pretty much accept that. Something has to cause a change, an efficient cause, yeah, we can pretty much accept that. The final cause is the one that probably hurts our intuition the most. Why does it have to be any purpose in mind? Why can't the change just happen? And in modern science, we don't spend any time looking for any final causes. We just focus on the material, the formal, and the efficient cause. But, so it appears that in every change, there is this final cause, a purpose for the sake of which the change occurs. Everything in the universe seems to be striving towards some final end. An oak tree, in virtue of being an oak tree, is constantly trying to become a more perfect oak and preserve its oakiness. And earth, in virtue of being earth, is always trying to fall to the center of the earth. And so, everything in the universe must be working towards the final end. Now, he also likes this because of the great order that he sees in the universe. If there's going to be some great order, there has to be some great purpose in mind. You don't get order randomly. So he says, how would the atomists who claim that there is no purpose and that everything that occurs is a chance event, account for the uniformity in our universe? If it was always just chance, how come an acorn never becomes a maple? There seems to be something guiding that acorn every single time. Acorns only ever become oaks, never get a pine tree popping up. Very strange. Why not? Must be some purpose somehow embedded in that acorn. So in all natural change, everything is striving to get where it's ultimately going. So in all natural change, what we mean there is that the formal and final cause are one and the same thing, if you look at the whole change. So if I look at the acorn turning all the way into an oak, what did it turn into? An oak. Why? For the sake of turning into an oak. If I look at a rock falling to the ground, ultimately, why did it get to the ground? Its formal cause is being on the ground. Why did it fall to the ground? To get to the ground. So with natural change, if you look at the whole change of the object from start to finish, it seems like these formal and final cause are one and the same thing. So in this sense, formal and final cause are one and the same thing. The acorn becomes an oak. To become an oak, the rock fell to the ground to get to the ground. Good there? Okay. So with this, Aristotle is what we call a universal teleologist. He believes that there is ultimately purpose behind all action and change in the universe. Purpose behind everything. Now, Aristotle does not believe in perfect determinism. He does not think that, so in modern physics we kind of have this notion that if I start this object at this exact position and I hit it with this exact force, this exact weight, it will always follow this exact trajectory. Aristotle seems to think, let's see. So Aristotle does not believe in perfect determinism and thinks that there are chance factors that could prevent an object from becoming fully actualized. He noticed, you take a bunch of identical acorns and you plant them in the ground, try to keep absolutely identical circumstances. For some reason, 1 out of 100 don't become an oak. It's very strange. Did everything that you could to make it identical, and yet it just doesn't happen. So this leads Aristotle to think that natural laws are happening always, or for the most part. Maybe there's some things that always happen, but there's also these other things that just happen for the most part. And that it's possible the exceptions may never be fully understood. There could be this inherent randomness in the universe. So not everything's random, and there's purpose behind pretty much everything, but there can, in these very strange cases, be this weird inherent randomness. And some people look to this as his way of trying to sneak free will into his metaphysics. Because if everything's predetermined, then there's no such thing as free will. You never get to make a choice. And so some people argue that's one of the ways that you're able to preserve free will with this metaphysics. So the best explanation Aristotle has for the exceptions is to say that the form was somehow prevented from actualizing by its matter. Now this is kind of just piggybacking off of Plato a little bit. If you remember going all the way back to Plato, what are the objects in this universe? The forms are what actually really exists in the world of forms. What are the objects in this universe? They're particulars, but they're somehow shadows of the forms. And in his philosophy, there's no such thing as evil. What it is there's either good or lack of the good. And so to the extent that you are a perfect shadow of madness, you're good. And to the extent that you don't, you're not a good reflection of madness, you're bad. And that's what we mean by evil. It's just a poor reflection. And for some reason, this matter in the universe that you have is making you resistant to taking on that form. So that's what evilness is. And so this failure is somehow the matter just refusing to actualize itself, refusing to take on that form. Somehow, some way. Don't know why. So with this, we can see a few reasons why there was later hatred of Aristotle by more pop culture type scientists. One thing they don't like is he's putting purpose into things, which the Christian church is going to pick up on. And pop culture scientists are opposed to the Catholic Church, so anything the Catholic Church is supportive like Aristotle, they're naturally opposed to. The other thing they don't like is how he's introducing these chance factors rather than thinking about it as being perfectly deterministic. And thinking about these laws as happening always or for the most part. They don't like that part. And then the other reason that they don't like him is because his physics is just flat out wrong. He's wrong left to right. His method for going about and doing these things and making reference to empirical data is good. Great method, terrible results. Now, of course, that criticism holds for just about anyone doing science after enough time. They're going to be wrong across the board. It's really hard to be right in the sciences over an extended period of time. You can always say that they're right to some extent, and Aristotle is right to some extent. You got a box with enough friction. Yep, it's only moving when you're pushing it. He's right. Kind of.
Yeah.
Or you take a really dense object and you take a feather and you drop him. He's right. The denser object falls faster. Right, you can find particular situations where it works, but you try to generalize too much and it's going to break down. So, that's some of that. Okay, now, Aristotle himself, even though the Christians pick up on him later and change this, Aristotle's teleology is immanent. The purpose for what you do is somehow within you. So his teleology is an immanent one. The objects strive towards their own end or their own self-actualization. They do not strive towards some exterior cosmic end. So later Christians want to say, Christians would say it's all happening for God's purposes. That is not what Aristotle is saying. Plato would say it's all happening for the form of the good. Aristotle would not say that that's what's happening. The reason you do what you do is to actualize yourself. It's for your own purpose, and that purpose is somehow endowed in you. The reason that the acorn grows into the oak is because of a purpose somehow endowed in that acorn. So there isn't some overarching plan that everything's happening for. It's that it's somehow naturally endowed in each object what its purpose is. It's somehow naturally endowed in this object that its purpose is to go down. It's not too different from, I don't know, how you would describe mass now. What does mass mean? It means it's naturally endowed with attraction to other things with mass, if you're trying to explain gravity with mass. Okay. So, note that this sets up the metaphysical foundations for Aristotle's ethics, that a man ought to strive towards his own self-actualization. So, he's going to say, every man is endowed with, inherently, by virtue of being a man, you are endowed with this purpose. And your purpose is to actualize yourself, to be the best man that you could possibly be. And that's going to be the whole foundation of his ethics. Okay. Now, we covered all that. Now we've got to introduce motion into our universe. Okay, so we understand when a change occurs, then this is what we've got to talk about, and here's what happens. But how does change ever actually occur in the universe? Remember that one of those causes is called the efficient cause, that cause it to come into existence. And whatever that efficient cause is, it has to have a cause. You think about a boulder gets hit by a tree and rolls down the hill. Okay, what's the efficient cause? The tree that fell over. Well, what caused the tree to fall over? Well, there's a lightning bolt that struck out. Okay, what caused the lightning bolt? Well, the clouds were moving like this. Okay, what caused the clouds to move like that? And so you got this infinite regression that you have to follow. So how do we get motion in our universe at all? How do we ever get any change? So now, how do we explain motion in the universe as such? What keeps the universe in motion? Why doesn't the universe eventually wind down to just being in some static state? Now that makes more sense if you remember, Aristotle thinks force is equal to mass times velocity. You got to keep pushing on things to keep them going. So you push on a box, it eventually winds down. So it's very natural in his thinking of physics to think that the universe would eventually naturally wind down. So how do we explain motion in the universe as such, and what keeps the universe in motion, and why doesn't it ultimately wind down and stop? What is the cause of motion? So that's what we're going to talk about next, is the cause of motion. What ultimately causes this universe? What ultimately causes motion in this universe? Now, we do not mean what was the first motion in time. You might think just follow the lightning bolt back and follow the clouds back and keep tracking back with some change that occurs, and you'll eventually get some infinite regression all the way back to some first motion. Maybe not infinite, but some first motion. Aristotle says that's not what we're looking for. Aristotle believes in an eternal universe, and so motion must have always existed. And so you might think, okay, so it's just an infinite string of events, right? Aristotle would say, no, we can't even have this motion is caused by some infinite string of events. Because then, in order for this event to cause this event, it has to go through an infinite chain, which going through an infinite chain of events is impossible.
Why?
Because this event happened sometime in the past. When in the past did it happen? Even if it's 10 trillion years ago, 10 trillion years is not enough time for an infinite number of events to occur. you get into really weird philosophical grounds when you start saying that infinities have to somehow actually exist.
Yeah, but that sounds a lot like Zeno's paradox.
Zeno's paradox was trying to force infinity to actually exist. Aristotle is simply saying that you can't have a motion infinitely far in the past causing the motion now. Doesn't work. Because it has to undergo an infinite stream of events. You'd have to actually have an infinite number of things happen, which he doesn't think is possible. So Aristotle thinks that our universe is eternal. It doesn't have some beginning, and so must have always been in motion, must have always existed. There isn't some first motion for Aristotle. Now, for him, he talks about, think about how we measure time. What's a year?
It's how long it takes for the Earth to go around the sun.
What's a day?
How long it takes for the Earth to rotate.
The Earth to spin around. Even if you think about like a grandfather clock, what's a second? It's how long it takes a pendulum to go back and forth. So for Aristotle, time is simply the measure of motion. Time is simply the measure of motion. So time is simply the measure of motion. 1 year is a measure of the Earth going around the sun. 1 day the Earth making a spin on its rotation. Okay. A motionless universe then would be a timeless universe. So for Aristotle, to speak about a time in the universe where there was no motion would be to speak about a time in the universe where there was no time. Absurd. There's his contradiction. So he doesn't think that there is this first motion. He thinks the universe has always been and always will be. And he doesn't think that there's some first motion that you can go back to. Because then it would have had to have happened at timeless time. Which for him, contradiction. Therefore, motion must also be eternal. And so there is no first motion in this sense. Nothing that kicks it all off. So when looking for the cause of a motion, we are looking for the ultimate and eternal source of motion. He thinks that there's some external source kind of feeding motion into the universe to keep motion going from the universe. And so if we were to track some motion that just happened now, the change of that chalk falling, if we followed it back to all of its chain of events, we would ultimately work back to this source of motion in the universe. Make sense so far?
That's not first motion, it's just a source.
It's a source, which is the first efficient cause of that string of events that led to me dropping that chalk.
Is that not first motion? Why is that not like a first motion?
Of the universe as a whole?
Yeah.
Because maybe that was only 87 years ago. There can't be any first motion in the universe as a whole for Aristotle. You got an infinite universe, always has been motion, and so we can't have these infinite. We can't say that A causes B after an infinite amount of time. Otherwise, B would never actually occur. A can never actually cause B. Okay, so we've got this source of motion. Now, whatever this ultimate source of motion is, we're going to call it the mover. Just a name that we're going to throw on there. This mover. Whatever this ultimate source of motion is, we'll call it the mover. Now, what properties must this mover have? First off, it must be eternal. Since motion is eternal, the universe is eternal, and it is our source of motion. Second, it must be unmoved and immovable. If it's moved, what moves it? And we haven't answered anything. So it must be unmoved and immovable. If the mover moves, what explains its motion? And so we haven't gotten any further. It must have no potentiality. It can't change, it can't move. If it had potentiality, everything naturally works towards its actualization. If it has any potentiality, it's naturally going to move towards actualizing that potentiality. So it must have no potentiality, otherwise it would have to move to actualize itself. And so it must be pure actuality, or pure form. Remember we talked about how there's no such thing as pure matter for Aristotle. That can't actually exist. Pure form can. Here's the exception. His mover is pure form. No matter to it. And so it must not be physical, otherwise it'd have matter, and therefore potentiality. So it must be this unphysical, pure form thing. And it must be perfect. Why? Because it's completely actualized. It's as actualized gets. It's complete actuality. That's all it is.
Right.
So it's this extremely perfect, non-physical thing that's a source of all motion in the universe. Now you can see how Thomas Aquinas is going to pick up on that, and he's going to throw God on the label on that, and that's going to be some of his arguments for God is going to piggyback on what Aristotle says. So that's how the Catholic Church picks up on this mover. This mover, they ultimately throw God out on there when Aquinas comes along. So, thinking about this mover now. Now, how does such a mover cause motion? Let's try to think about this mover for a second. How on earth can they cause motion? They're one that cannot move themselves. They have no will. A will means you have some sort of desire, something to accomplish, something to actualize. So no wills, no desires. It can't push, it can't pull, it can't demand. It can't reveal its desires to you somehow, sprinkle them out there. It can't interact with you in any way. How is it the source of motion? So remember that the universe is ultimately nested spheres, with the outermost sphere being the sphere of the stars. So we got the Earth here, first sphere, second sphere, and then we got the sphere of the stars. On top of this, it is thought that there is some sort of intelligence attached to each of these spheres. Now this goes back to basic Greek mythology. The Greeks thought that different gods had different effects on the planets, and ultimately that's how one of the ways that they were able to affect the universe evolving. And that's why the planets have their different names of the gods. Mercury, Hermes,
Yep.
Venus, Aphrodite, Mars, Ares, Jupiter, Zeus, Saturn, Kronos. Not a god, but close enough. Same thing. So it still smells of that same theology there, but he obviously doesn't think that the Greek pantheon actually exists. However, Aristotle does think that there is some intelligence attached to these spheres. Why does he think that there must be some intelligence attached to these spheres? Now, imagine I got a little ramp right here, and I stuck a marble on the ramp. And I drop the marble, and you watch it, and it perfectly goes down and up and down and up. Now, you watch it a couple times, and you say, that's fine. Nothing strange about that. That's what marbles do. But imagine now, you watch this thing for 1,000 years, and it follows that perfect course every single time. Same course, never changes, and it just keeps moving this way. Now you say, someone's messing with me. Someone's rigged this. This isn't normal. This isn't natural. Somehow there's a mind behind this motion. Someone's messing with me.
Why did he
These spheres are moving too perfectly, too consistently for too long, for there not to be some intelligence guiding them.
Why did he think it was ether? Does it seem like that?
So ether naturally moves in circles, the same way that marble, the earth going down, naturally makes it move like this. So natural motion does things consistently or for the most part. But these are being too consistent to be natural. You don't get natural change this consistent without some purpose behind it. So there must be some purpose, some intelligence behind these spheres. Now he didn't call them gods or whatever, just some intelligence, and leaves it at that. They're somehow conscious, somehow aware, somehow able to act kind of like humans do with purpose. So, now Aristotle thought that all motion was ultimately communicated along these spheres, going from the outer and most perfect sphere inward. I think I have a picture here. Yeah. So, what does he mean by this? Motion is communicated from the stars inward to Saturn. Saturn is able to communicate inward with Jupiter. Jupiter with Mars, and motion is able to be communicated this direction. In other words, the sun is able to cause motion on the earth. The earth is not able to cause motion on the sun. Motion is communicated this way. It's very strange. We watch this all the time. The sun moves, bats come out. Somehow the sun causes bats to move. Or the sun moves and you watch the leaves on the plant lean towards the sunlight. Sun comes out, water evaporates, goes up as rain, or goes up as clouds, then comes back down as rain. Somehow the sun is causing this. The moon comes out, pulls the tides. Somehow the moon is causing motion, the sun is causing motion. These spheres seem to be able to cause motion here on Earth. And so for Aristotle, if we were to carefully track You know, that tree falling over and hitting the boulder? If we were to carefully follow the efficient cause all the way back, we would end up following it through some chain back out to the stars. Now, what is outside the sphere of the stars? Here is where our prime mover exists. So inside the universe, motion communicated inwards towards the Earth. How do we get the stars to move? We'll put that on hold for a second. But outside of that, say we get the stars moving. Does it make sense how we thought all the other motion falls from that? Okay. So, thus, if we can explain the motion of the most outer sphere, the sphere of the fixed stars, we can explain motion in the universe as such. This constant source of motion. Now, the intelligence connected with the outermost sphere is aware of the prime mover. The prime mover is not aware of the sphere of the stars. The sphere of the stars, and that intelligence attached to it, is somehow aware of the prime mover, which somehow exists outside the sphere of the stars. That's pure actuality. How it's aware, I don't know. But it's aware of it. And being aware of it and aware of its perfection, in an attempt to emulate the perfection of the prime mover, the intelligence attached with the fixed stars causes them to rotate in the most perfectly spherical rotation. And that is the ultimate cause of motion in our universe. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Now, how on earth does the fixed stars seeing the perfection of the prime mover cause the fixed stars to move? Well, as a philosopher explaining this once gave an example. He said, imagine that you got this extremely beautiful woman and you send her in a bar full of men. She's completely oblivious of all these men and watch all the motion it creates in the men as they wish to participate in her perfection. So too, the fixed stars move in this perfect spherical motion so as to participate in the perfection of this prime mover. Just an analogy, but funny one that sticks. So that's ultimately how we get all our motion in our universe. And now it's all explained. Going out to the prime mover, the unmoved mover. Any questions on that? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the nature of this prime mover then. So what's the nature of the prime mover? It has no physicality, and so it must be a mind. Since it's a mind, what do minds do? They think. So if it's a mind, it must think. But it must do a motionless and unchanging kind of thinking. So that means it can't think about things that change. So what can it think about? It can't think about nothing. That's a thought about nothing. That's not thinking. It can only contemplate itself. So this prime mover is thought contemplating itself. And that's all it can contemplate. So the prime mover is often described as thought thinking about itself. That's what it's doing out there. It's out there thinking about itself. Completely oblivious to the existence of this universe. This prime mover. This cosmic mind is often referred to as Aristotle's God. And you can make sense of why it's referred to as Aristotle's God. Closest thing he's got to a God in his philosophy. Now, Aquinas will later combine Aristotle's views with Christianity and will in large part become the official position of the Catholic Church, once again generating more resentment against Aristotle in later years. Too closely tied to the Catholic Church.
Why does it have to be a mind if it doesn't have physicality? Like, why is that?
Why does it have to be a mind? If it exists and it is completely non-physical, through our experience, what thing do we know of that is completely non-physical and exists? Our mind. And what goes on in our minds. So,
Does that mean it's the only thing that?
no, there's no way for him to say that this is the only thing out there that exists. Remember that Aristotle in no way is saying, here's the way it is. He is saying, here's my best explanation for the way it is. Here's the problems, and I'm on my way.
Yeah.
Remember, for Aristotle, he's a biologist.
Yeah.
He's developing all the fields he needs to develop to explain everything that he needs to develop as he goes. And if he runs into a problem with it, he points out there's this problem and goes on his merry way. So just trying to explain it the best he can with the facts he has. The facts he has is minds are non-physical things. According to his theory, this prime mover has to be a non-physical thing. Must be a mind. He also likes it being a mind. When we get into his ethics, he's going to really like the contemplative life. Someone who spends their time thinking. He's going to have a lot to say about that. So, as a thinker, probably has a bit of a bias towards it being a great mind out there. Anything else on that? All right. So, here is his hierarchy going from our least perfect to our most perfect things. So at the bottom of the existence hierarchy is prime matter. Now, prime matter can't actually exist. If it actually exists, it has to exist as something. It must have a form. So if you ever get prime matter to actually exist, it has to, in its most base form, it's either going to be one of our 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and air. That's the second most base type of existence there is. Now you can start combining earth, water, fire, and air together to get all sorts of compounds, inorganic compounds. Compounds that don't possess organs, like living things do. Inorganic compounds. And then we get to our first living things, plant life, which is the lowest form of life. And then we get to animal life. Finally, we get to man on here. Now, unfortunately, we're not at the top. There's the intelligence that moves the different spheres. They're somehow superior to man.
Why?
Because they're further out there. And the further away we get from terrestrial, the better we are. The more perfect we are.
We can't live in perfect spheres.
Yeah. You could not keep up that circular motion for even 100 years. Look at those guys go. And then finally, the prime mover, the most perfect thing of all. And this is also related to how actualized you are. The more actualized you are, the more perfect you are on this scale. The less actualized you are, the more matter you are, the lower you are on the scale. So there's this hierarchy for things in existence, metaphysical hierarchy. And I think that pretty much covers his metaphysics, and now we're ready for his psychology. Any other questions on his metaphysics or physics? All right, now let's jump into his psychology. Psychology, the study of the soul. It's going to be the second half now of his epistemology. We already covered it in the Organon, how thought is structured and how to organize bodies of knowledge. Now we're going to talk about how humans come to learn, how humans come to know. And it's the process of the soul that causes you to come to know things. So that's largely what we're focused on here with this psychology. So psychology, study of the soul if you look at its etymology. Now the soul for Aristotle is the principle for life. Any living thing has a soul. He is not going to use soul here a way that would be intuitive to you. A soul is just going to be a living thing, and he's going to use mind probably closer to what your intuition would say is a soul. So some souls have a mind. Some living things have a mind. Soul is very closely tied to living thing. Okay, so the soul for Aristotle is the principle for life. Any living thing has a soul. The same way that possessing manness is what makes a living thing a man, so possessing a soul is what makes a thing a living thing. If it has a soul, it's a living thing. Possessing a soul is an essential property of every living thing. What's the difference between an essential property and an accidental property?
Essential property is something that something has to have in order for it to be that thing. And the accidental property is something that is accidental.
It's like
Perfect.
built in for actualization, right?
Well, the way he said it, it gives you good intuition. It's what it has to have for it to continue to be that thing. If I were to change one of your essential properties, I change fundamentally what you are. If I change it,
Then I'm not me anymore, yeah.
Right. You wouldn't be you anymore. Whatever's left is whatever's left. If I cut off my left arm, that's having 2 arms, that's accidental. Nothing essential about having 2 arms. You somehow get rid of my life, okay, now I'm something fundamentally different. I'm no longer Donnie Timpson. I'm something else, namely a corpse. So if you get rid of an essential property, you fundamentally change what the thing is, rather than just changing a property that thing has. So having a soul is an essential property. Another one that we'll talk about, well, maybe I'll mention it later. So anyways, since an essence makes a thing what it is, then soul is the form of any living thing. And the body that is living is the matter of any living thing. So any living thing is its body together with its living principle, which we're going to call soul here. Those two things together is what gives us this living organism. You need the body and you need the soul together. Now you got a living organism. If you somehow remove the soul from the body, it falls over dead. It no longer has that living principle in it. The soul is the living principle. So soul, here's one way that Aristotle described it. The actuality of a natural body having life potentially in it. So we've got a body that potentially has life in it. If we actualize that potentiality, we now have soul, a living thing. Soul is to body, as form is to matter, as actuality is to potentiality. Aristotle gives two analogies. He says it's like a mark stamped on wax. The wax is the body. The mark that you impose on the wax, that you stamp on there, that's the soul. Or the capacity for vision in the eye. The eye is like the body. Its ability to see is the soul. Make sense? So I'm not talking about it as some spirit encased in a body. That's not the way he's using it. So the soul, therefore, is not independently an entity. It is simply an aspect of a living entity. The soul ceases to be when the body ceases to be living. Doesn't make sense in the way he's using this to have a soul outside of a body. That makes no sense. Now, the fundamental properties of a soul, or of a living thing, is essentially the ability to take in nutrition, grow, and reproduce. How do you empirically determine whether or not something has soul? It can do these three things. If it can do those three things, then we're going to call it something that possesses a soul. We're going to call it a living thing. If it can't do one of those three things, then we're going to say it's not a living thing, which is largely the definition that we use for something being alive today, pretty close to what it is. One of the main reasons that we say bacteria is alive and viruses aren't is because bacteria can reproduce on their own, a virus can't. It has to have a host cell. So, bacteria, soul, viruses, sorry, no soul. Those soulless viruses. When a thing has these properties, it is a living thing. So, there's our empirical test. Now, for Aristotle, there are three types of souls. There's a vegetative soul. Hopefully you can see, I don't know, can you see these outline boxes here?
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of highlight it for a second. And then the obvious one. So, all plants have what is called a vegetative soul. All plants are capable of reproduction, growth, and taking in nutrients. Outside of that, animals have a superior soul to vegetables. Because not only can they do these things, but they have a sensitive soul. They are able to take in sensations. They have sensations. They can smell, taste, touch, hear. And they have mobility. They can move. Now, he does not mean movement, like you might think a plant, well, it grows out its root, or it turns its light towards the sun. Isn't that a motion? And Aristotle is going to say, it's not the kind of motion that we're talking about here. It's not a motion generated from your sensations. So we'll think about you for a second, since you have both these types of souls in you. One, your heart's beating. That is a vegetative type motion. That's not the type of mobility he's talking about here. On the other hand, you see food and you walk over and you go get the food. Based off of your sensations that you're having, you decide to go take some course of action. Make a choice about it. That's the type of mobility that he's talking about here. You're actually able to choose to take that course of action. You can't choose to stop your heartbeat. A plant can't choose to stop its leaves from turning towards the sunlight. So that's not the type of motion he's talking about. So it's fundamentally different so far with the plants and the animals. We good so far there? And then finally, we get the rational soul. This is one that's capable of thought, of reflection, of generating arguments, sciences. And only man, of all the living things on earth, has this type of soul. But of course, we also have a sensitive soul, and we also have a vegetative soul.
What about like the intelligences that are in spirits? Do they have a soul that's higher than a rational soul?
We don't have thoughts.
We are talking about psychology, which has to do with the study of the soul, which has to do with living things. And so I don't think that he would call those living things. They're somehow above it.
They have intelligence, but they're not living.
They seem to have intelligence, but he's not going to call it a soul because they're not a living thing. He can't kill them. They seem in some sense eternal, divine.
I'm not sure.
Somehow beyond psychology. Okay, good question. Anything else on those? Okay, so there's the three types of souls, and you have these three pieces to your soul. And it's possible for you to exist using this piece, or just this piece, or even just this piece. And each of these pieces are somehow essential parts of you as well. So for Aristotle, if I were to take you and inflict enough brain damage on you so that you now existed in a vegetative state, so that only your vegetative soul is acting, I have in some sense destroyed you. You're in some sense not what you were. And I've somehow killed you. You're now brain dead.
Because you need all those things because they're essential aspects.
Each of these pieces of a soul is an essential property.
Yeah.
So if you have this, removing that somehow is changing you. And you're not what you were. Or if I take an animal and I suddenly damage it enough that it's in now a completely vegetative state, it's now just functioning with its vegetative soul. That's what we mean. Similarly, how do you go from this to this? You act like a brute. What's a brute?
An animal.
An animal that's not man. It's a non-man animal. That's what a brute is. And so when you just completely act on your sensations and never take time for thought or reflection, you're in some sense,
An animal.
yeah, you're in some sense not this thing here.
But it's-
And so a man, in some sense, is like killing himself.
But you need all three things to be fully actualized, I would assume.
To be fully actualized. So acting like a brute, not good. Acting like a vegetable, not good. When we get to man, man needs to exercise this rational part of his soul that's going to be built into his ethics. That somehow makes you superior. Okay, any other questions with the three parts of the soul so far? Okay, so this means for Aristotle that one, there can be no soul without a body, and two, that there is no metaphysical dichotomy between the soul and the body. The two together allow a natural being to strive for its full actualization. Remember going back to Plato, Plato wants to somehow think about you as a soul encased in a body. And those two are at war with each other. And the soul is working to escape itself from the body. And is always trying to get away from the things of the body. Aristotle says, no, the body is a good thing. It's the body and the soul together that enables you to completely actualize yourself. If I got rid of your body, you can no longer actualize yourself. That's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. Being alive, good for Aristotle. Not good to die. Good to live. So, want to make note of that. Any questions about that? Okay, so next. Aristotle was the first to define the five senses, and this is so ubiquitous in our culture. When I say the five senses, you probably already know what they are. Smell, taste, touch, hearing, what did I miss? Seeing. The most obvious one, couldn't see it. All right, so Aristotle was the first one to define the five senses and to declare which organs are responsible for which senses. Remember, a large part of our psychology is going to be talking about how human beings learn. He believes the senses only communicate the data to us. Our senses cannot lie to us since they cannot make judgments. And only judgments can be true or false. Remember going back to our sophist. What would our sophist do? Our sophist would stick his hand in hot water and then stick it in room temperature water, and he'd say, oh, how cool. Another sophist goes and sticks his hand in really cold water and then sticks it in room temperature water and says, oh, how warm. And so they say, what is the room temperature water? Is it warm or is it cold? Our senses tell us one thing and our senses tell us another thing. So our senses somehow deceive us. They lie to us. Or take your pencil and you stick it in the glass of water and it looks bent. Our senses are lying to us. That's not how the world actually is. So our senses deceive us. They lie to us. Aristotle says, no. Your senses just feed you the data as it is. And so when you stick your hand from the hot to the cold, you're feeling energy leaving your hand. And that's what you're feeling. And that's what's happening. And when you go from the cold to the warm, then you feel heat going into your hand. You feel your hand warming up, and that's the sensation you feel. The data tells you exactly what the facts are. You may come to a bad conclusion based off of the data you're given. That's not the data's fault. That's your fault. Data can't lie. If you're a bit naive and I say, watch, I'm going to bend this pencil, and I stick it in a cup of water and I say, see, it bent, you might think the senses are lying to you, or you came to a bad conclusion. If you were to carefully observe all the facts and you'd actually say, well, actually, it's water somehow causes light to bend this way, and you discover something called Snell's law. That's what's actually going on. Your senses can't lie to you. They give you the facts as it is. What if I have glasses? I take off my glasses and everything looks blurry. Ah, my senses are telling me everything has blurry edges. No, your senses are telling you you have a defunct eye. They're telling you the facts exactly as they are. There's always some correlation in reality for the data that you're getting, and you can always figure out what it is. So your senses cannot lie to you. This is the thing that probably drove him the most nuts about all the philosophers that came before him. Pretty much every single one of them says, illusions, 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 illusions. Aristotle says, no, you have to start with the sense data. You have to take that for granted and go from there. You can't call it an illusion. You can't say it's lying to you. No, you're coming to bad judgments based on the data. So he believes the senses only communicate the data to us. Our senses cannot lie to us since they cannot make judgments. Your eyeball cannot tell you something. It can just communicate the data. And only judgments are true or false. You, namely your soul, is what makes the judgment. In particular, the mind part of your soul is what makes that judgment as to whether or not it's true or it's false. That pencil's bent or it's not. The water's hot or it's cold. You could be misled. However, our senses do affect our perception. A poor eye sees a blur. So, our sense organs is what I meant to say there.
Yeah.
Our sense organs affect our perception. But that's telling you something about your sense organs. And so it's still giving you the facts as they are. So the process of sensation is a process, a type of change, a passage from potentiality to actuality. So in sensation, we're going to have something being actualized every time. So Aristotle's sensation, a little bit weird. Sensation is a dual actualization, one which occurs in the sense organ and one which occurs in the object being sensed. Now we're going to focus on this first one. So we're saying any time there's a perception that goes on, two things are changing. There's a change happening in your sense organ, if you're sensing something, and there's a change happening in the thing being sensed. We're going to focus on the change that happens in your sense organ first. So, for example, you stick your hand in a cold bucket of water. What's the change? Aristotle says your hand actually gets cold. And so your hand takes on the sensation from that bucket that you sense. When I see an apple, if you look close to my eye, there's actually an apple there in my eye.
There's a reflection of what you're seeing.
But there's something physical there in my eye that you can see. If we're talking about the temperature I'm feeling, you can feel it. If we're talking about the thing I'm seeing, you can see it. If we're talking about the sound I'm hearing, if you look real closely at my eardrum, you can see it vibrating. So, whenever you sense something, there's going to be there's a dual actualization going on. One which occurs in the sense organ, and one which occurs in the object being sensed. We're going to focus on the sense organ first. So when you perceive, the sense organ comes to possess the quality being sensed. Let me say it again. When you perceive, the sense organ comes to possess the quality being sensed. When I stick my hand in snow and I feel cold, my hand becomes cold. When I see red, red shows up in my eye. So when you feel something cold, your hand becomes cold. When you look at a red tomato, there's an image of a red tomato in your eye. So, prior to the sensation, your sense organ has the potential to reproduce that quality being sensed. then in sensing the quality, the sense organ actually reproduces the quality. That makes sense?
When you like.
When I sense cold, it is because coldness is actually being reproduced on my hands. When I see red, it's because redness is actually being produced on my eye.
What about like smell? How do you reproduce something that you're smelling?
That smell somehow exists right there. Smell might be a harder one, but
There are some
taste,
smells that-
I could go get the taste of that Jolly Rancher on my tongue, and then I could go kiss my wife, and she could get the taste of that Jolly Rancher. That taste is somehow there on my tongue. Okay. So then, in sensing the quality, the sense organ actually reproduces the quality.
Usually you'll smell like something that you have been smelling. Like later, like you'll go away and you still smell that.
Now, we're going to talk about quantitative and qualitative properties. Aristotle did not introduce these names. These are just the names philosophy now uses for these types of properties. So now, while quantitative properties exist in reality, qualitative properties do not. Quantitative, why is it called quantitative? Because you can assign some quantity to it. It's measurable. Your mass is a quantitative property. I can measure your mass. You're feeling cold is a qualitative property. I can't measure you're feeling cold. In particular, what can we measure? Things in terms of units of meters, seconds, kilograms, or, well, we can say those three for now. Right. So things that you can somehow apply units to. So, while the quantitative properties exist in reality, you in reality actually have a height. Qualitative properties do not. You do not actually have a color. Qualitative properties are simply how quantitative properties are observed. Say that again. Qualitative properties are simply how quantitative properties are observed.
So the quality is how you observe the quantity.
Give you an example. Let's say I want to get your height. There's a quantitative property. How do I actually get your height? I get some yardstick behind you that goes all the way up. And I have you stand next to it. And I see where the color changes between brown and white or whatever it is. It's a qualitative change, color to color. And I see that that change happened close to the 68th mark on here. And so I say, you are 68 inches or 5'8" tall. I can't see your height. I can't look at you and see 5'8". I can see changes in color, and I can use that to figure out, you're 5'8". So we only experience qualitative properties. We do not experience quantitative properties. But quantitative properties are what exists in reality, not the qualitative properties. Qualitative properties are properties that only exist in the process of sensation. Quantitative properties are the things out there that actually exist. I can determine quantitative properties by looking at qualitative properties. I can't look at your weight. I can have you stand on a scale and look at the way the colors on the pixels change and give me some reading out. Or I can pick you up and feel how heavy you are, or whatever. So, kind of strange. So, we'll kind of focus on color. So, since redness does not exist in nature, a tomato is not red in and of itself. Right? There's no such thing out there as red. Let's kind of think real carefully about the color for a second. What is red?
It's a wavelength of light.
So that's something that we would say in a physics course, and we're being lazy in our speech. What are we really saying? We're really saying that photons with such a frequency, when observed by an observer, reproduces the sensation of redness in their mind. Right? A frequency is a frequency. Red's not a frequency, it's a color.
Right.
It's very strange what happens there. It's this photon moving along with this frequency. It hits your eye, creates all this biological reactions, whatever goes on, and then finally this conscious observer behind it all sees red. What does the red have to do with that photon having a frequency? It's very strange. You make some certain vibration, nothing. You make a different vibration, and suddenly it reproduces sound that I'm conscious and aware of. So color isn't a photon. Photons are able to communicate colors to us based on their frequency. Sound isn't a wave. We're able to use waves to cause sound to be something you experience. So if you think about it carefully like that, you can understand why for Aristotle there's no redness out there. Something isn't endowed with red. Red is an experience you have by observing. Okay. So, since redness does not exist in nature, a tomato is not red in and of itself. It does, however, possess the potentiality for being perceived as red. Whatever the physical makeup of that tomato is, it is such that, when viewed with photons bouncing off of it by an observer endowed with eyes like ours, it will create the sensation of red. And so there's something physical in that tomato that makes so that when we perceive it as red. It has that physical structure, but that physical structure is not redness. It's something outside of that. It's some quantitative property ultimately creating that qualitative response in us. So a tomato is not red. A tomato has the potentiality for being perceived as red by some observer who can see. That makes sense? A bit technical.
So, is something red if it's not observed?
No. Imagine that you got rid of all sighted things in the universe. Color is no longer a concept. Imagine all human beings were blind, never had eyes. Color is no longer a concept. Color is something an observer experiences. It is not something that exists in the object. That's what he's trying to say here. Okay. So, say that again. So, since redness does not exist in nature, a tomato is not red in and of itself. It does, however, possess the potentiality for being perceived as red. Note that this is not arbitrary, as it does not have the potentiality to be observed as any other color. It's not an accident that we always agree that tomatoes are red. That has something to do with the structure of tomatoes, it's just not the redness in it. It's whatever that physical structure is that causes it to be perceived as red when viewed. And that physical structure is its potentiality. That matter that it actually has gives it its potentiality. What it physically is determines what potentially can happen. Okay, overstressing it? So then, when perception occurs, it is now actually perceived as red. And so this is the second actualization that goes on. So two actualizations go on in perception. One, you actually take on the quality that is being sensed. And two, the thing that potentially should be perceived that way now actually is being perceived that way. And those are the two things actualized in every sensation. That make sense? Okay, so you go from potentially having the tomato in your eye to actually having the tomato in your eye. And the tomato goes from potentially being viewed as red, that's what we mean by is red, is it's viewed as red. So the tomato goes from potentially being red to actually being red. Make sense? Okay. So those are the two things that happen. Now, the objects of sense come in two kinds. Those that are proper to a particular sense, such as color, meaning only the eye sees. I can't see with my finger, I can't see with my nose, I can't see with my ear. So we've got two kinds of things that we sense. Those that are proper to a particular sense, such as color, and those that are perceptible by more than one sense, such as motion. And so motion is something that we call common sensible. I could see something move, or I could be standing here and hear you walk in. Or I don't know, if you wear a certain fragrance and you come walking in, maybe I smell you, and I say, oh, you must have come in. I know you're there. Or I smell fresh grass, I know someone's mowing the lawn somewhere.
Yeah.
So there's things that we can only perceive with a particular organ, and then there's other things that we can sense through many of our senses. Those things are called common sensible. Although there is no special organ for detecting common sensibles, there is a faculty that Aristotle calls your central sense or your common sense. This is where the word comes from. You talk about someone's common sense. It's their central sense or their common sense. What does this do? It unifies our various sensations into the perception of a single object. So, when you give me something like an apple, I take into, maybe the apple's falling through the air, so I take it to its motion. I take into account its color. I take into account its smell. All those sensations I take in at once, and it gives me the perception of an apple falling. I don't take those things individually and then reconstruct them in my mind. I'm taking in the whole, all of it in one go, giving me one perception. So we're constantly having these perceptions over and over again, not individual sense data. So Aristotle thought that you have this common sense, which takes in all those sensations and reproduces it for you, a perception of what's going on. So you get a bunch of individual sense data that you're being bombarded by. Your common sense is able to convert it into just one simple perception. Good so far?
Yeah.
So, to give you a picture of it, for Aristotle, you take in sense data, it runs through your central or common sense, and it produces for you a perception. You take into it all, and you have the perception of seeing an apple, or seeing a dog, or whatever it is. Example, you take it to redness, smoothness, sweet, etc., all the characteristics, run it through your common sense, and apple comes out. You're saying, I'm perceiving an apple. Or you're perceiving an apple, not you say it. But you perceive it. Make sense?
Yeah.
Overseeing it? Okay. So those are your external senses, but now we also have internal senses. So along with the external senses and the central sense, or the common sense, so you have your 5 external senses, then you have your central sense or common sense. Aristotle also identifies some inner senses. And among these are memory, imagination, and then intellect or mind. We'll say mind from here on out. And the mind is the one that we're going to focus on. These are internal. Inner senses is what I call them. Focusing now on the mind. Because the mind is obviously the one that we're going to use the most as man, being rational animals. Mind then, he splits into, he says it has 2 faculties. One that is going to be passive and one that is going to be active. The passive one is going to take things in, and then the active one is going to use what's taken in to do things. So the passive mind has the ability to take in or become any form. The passive part of the mind forms concepts from perceptions. So the passive part of my mind is able to, so I get my sense data, goes through my common sense, and I have the perception now of an apple. That goes to the passive part of my mind, and the passive part of my mind is the one that's able to identify the abstraction apple.
So it is your common sense?
No. So we get sense data, and that goes through our central or our common sense, which creates a perception. Those perceptions then go into our passive mind, which then is where we are able to abstract and finally form our concepts.
Okay.
Think about a little child. How do I get a little child to understand dog? I set up some scenario where they're able to have perception of dog. Another scenario where they're able to have perception of dog. Another scenario where they're able to have perception of dog. The child takes in the form that it sees each time in that perception into the passive part of their mind and eventually forms a concept of dog. So for Aristotle, and this will go back to why his prime mover was a mind now. For Aristotle, mind is the place forms can exist independent of objects.
Right.
So there's 2 places chairness exists. One place chairness exists is right there in that chair. that actually has a form of being a chair. But my mind is so constituted as to recognize that as a chair. And I can hold the concept of chair, that form of chairness, in my mind. And so thought happens in, well, so forms, which are actualities, occur only in minds, which is why your prime mover has to be a mind. Because it's completely actualized. Okay, so far we've talked about the passive mind. Say this one more time. The passive mind has the ability to take in or become any form. The passive part of the mind forms concepts from perceptions. Now the active part of the mind. The active part of the mind has the ability to construct or make any form. Sorry, I said that word. The active part of the mind has the ability to construct or make any form. It's a constructive part of you. It can take concepts that you already have and start constructing things with them.
Like math?
Like math. And for Aristotle, this is also the immortal part of you, if he argues that you have an immortal part. We're in his psychology, and unfortunately, this is one of his works that history has made a mess of. And so the ordering is messed up, pages were lost, lots of things have been changed, and so it's one of the harder works to come up with a good interpretation of. If Aristotle argued for immortality, then it's this part of you that's immortal, this active soul,
In what sense?
or this active mind.
In what sense is it immortal?
If you die, it somehow persists.
In what? Like what?
How and where and when? So Aristotle is completely focused on life in this universe. He is completely uninterested in, if you're immortal, where you were before life and where you are after life. When we focus on his ethics, he's not going to tell you, like a religion would, about how to have a good existence. He's going to say, I'm going to tell you how to live a good life. We're going to focus on life. And we're not going to look beyond that. So that's one of the reasons it's hard to nail down exactly how he thought about immortality, is because he thought what matters right now is what we're in right now. And so that's what he focused on, is what's in front of us right now. But I think he did intend it to be immortal, because he talks about immortality a few other places. So in some sense, it seems like he is implying that there is an immortal aspect to you. And if it's anything, because it's not your soul, with how he's using soul here, it's this active part of your mind. So this is part of you. It can construct propositions, arguments, and sciences. Remember, the passive part of your mind cannot even construct a proposition. It can only form concepts. And that's as far as it went. So following our training here, you get sense data that goes through your common sense, and you have perception. So this is, you see, you're getting particular colors, smells, sounds, goes through your common sense, and you say, dog. There's your concept. Or that's your perception. Sorry. Gives you the perception of the dog, sorry. Then that goes through your passive mind, and you're able to abstract away, dog. So that's what the child does when they have a lot of perceptions of dog. Enough of them go into their passive mind, finally they form the concept dog. And they might also form the concept cat. Then they might take those two things together, run it through their active mind now, and form the proposition, dogs don't like cats. And then, again, we can take our propositions, run it through our active mind, and form arguments from it. That's what the organon was focused on, largely. How do you construct arguments? That's what the prior analytics was focused on. And again, you can run arguments through your active mind, and that's how you develop fields of study, sciences.
Where do emotions fit in that? Like, do they exist in the mind?
Aren't they sense data?
The emotions for him are going to be associated with your sensitive soul. So for Aristotle, an animal can have an emotion.
That makes sense.
An animal cannot form a science.
Right.
I should say a brute, a non-human animal. Dogs can't form sciences. A dog can get mad. So focusing on your highest part of your soul.
So the sensitive soul doesn't have an active mind? Almost?
The sensitive soul does. So I tried to focus on that when we talked about mobility. in that it can choose to do things. But it doesn't choose to do things through a sort of thought and reflection. It's just immediately responding to desire. You're hungry, you go eat. Guy makes you mad, you punch him. They're just constantly responding to whatever the spur of the moment is. That's what we mean by someone's acting brutal. They're not thinking. So there's still choice there. So Aristotle thinks that a dog has an agency. A dog can choose to do something and choose not to do that thing. And you can train a dog to behave one way as opposed to another way. You can't train a rock. You can't train a tree. So that mobility that we were talking about here, when we had mobility there, that was that kind of choosing.
That makes sense.
Okay. Good. Good questions. Anything else so far?
So he would consider your mind has three parts to it: your common sense, your passive mind, and your active mind.
He did not include your central or common sense with your mind. For him, a dog still has a common sense. A dog does not have a mind in the sense that he's using it here.
So that's something that also exists with the animal soul.
Sorry, the common sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Animals have perceptions.
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
Okay, anything else? Okay. So now, in thinking about thought, Aristotle built upon his model for sensation. Just as in sensation, the organ actually takes in the quality being sensed, so too in thought, your mind actually takes in the form of the object being perceived. So when you form the concept of a dog, you are actually taking in the form of the dog into your mind. Just as when your eye sees the apple, your eye actually takes the image of the apple into the eye. When your mind forms the concept of dog, it actually takes the form of dog into the mind. And there the form exists inside your mind. One example he gives is thinking about consumption. So think about when you eat a carrot. When you eat a carrot, the matter of the carrot loses its form. You eat the carrot is no longer a carrot and it becomes part of you. And so the matter of the carrot goes from having the form of a carrot to instead having the form of you. And so in consumption, you take in the matter and you somehow leave behind the form. And so Aristotle explains, when your mind's forming a concept, it's the inverse happening. You're taking in the form of an object, leaving behind its matter. When I take in chairness from that chair, I don't actually take the chair into my mind. It's just its form, I'm somehow able to take into my mind. Same way in consumption, I'm somehow able to take the matter into my body. So, another analogy is thinking about consumption. When you eat a carrot, the matter of the carrot loses its form as the carrot becomes part of you. So consumption strips the form away from the matter and only takes in the matter. Similarly, in abstract thought, the mind takes in the form of the carrot and leaves behind the matter. The analogy makes sense there?
Good.
Cool. Therefore, thinking is a process of literally taking in the forms of things. And then also using those forms to construct new forms. But in its most basic level, you got to start by forming concepts. So thinking is a process of literally taking in the forms of things, incorporating them into your mind, and thereby becoming more formed in your mind. Or in other words, becoming informed, or well informed. Or taking in information. Where all these modern terms get their roots, it's in how Aristotle is using this word form. Are you well informed? I don't know. Have you taken into your mind a lot of forms and organized them in your mind? That is a well-formed mind. You are very informed. Okay. So, the mind is potentially capable of receiving and constructing all forms. In particular, the passive mind is capable of receiving into it any form. In other words, all things can potentially be known by the mind. Now, what must the nature of the mind be then if it can know anything? The passive part of you can have no pre-existing structure of its own. This is going to be a bit technical. We're getting ready to deal with Immanuel Kant. Maybe, should we come back to that? I don't know. It's kind of jumping ahead for what's coming down the road with philosophy. You want to do it or not? Should we do it? All right. So, it's going to be an argument for why the passive part of your mind can have no pre-existing structure. The passive part of your mind can have no pre-existing structure. Now, we'll just jump to Immanuel Kant because he's a good example of thinking that your mind has pre-existing structure. So if we go to Immanuel Kant's day, there was a big, Immanuel Kant is fast forwarding like 2,000 years.
Yeah.
We're going to see a log regression in 2,000 years. Fast forward to Immanuel Kant's day. One of the big questions is, how on earth is it that human beings can universally agree about bodies of knowledge, like geometry? That's one of the big questions. How on earth does this happen? Now, Immanuel Kant's big solution, what he called his Copernican revolution, is he says, it's not that we come to know anything about reality. It's not that there's metaphysical laws and we're applying those laws of logic to these propositions to come and know it. And since we all have the same metaphysical laws, we all agree. He says, no. It's that Euclidean geometry is somehow built into the structure of your mind. And that you can't help but accept Euclidean geometry is true. So he thought that you had built into your mind this Euclidean geometry lens, I'll call it. And that all the sense data that you receive goes through this Euclidean geometry lens, and that's why the world appears as though it conforms to Euclidean geometry. When I look at objects, they seem like they follow Euclidean geometry. If I yell and listen for the sound to come back and bounce, it seems to be following the rules of Euclidean geometry. If I close my eyes and feel the edge of some object, it seems to be following the rules of Euclidean geometry. No matter how I sense it, it does.
Why did he have come to the conclusion that that was based off of those things? Like you couldn't.
That you're learning about reality?
Yes.
Good question. We can't get into the modernists that come before him. But they made a mess of it. Can't tell the whole story, sorry. So we got to start with Immanuel Kant's solution. So Immanuel Kant thought that you had this Euclidean geometry structure built into your mind, and you can't help but perceive the world as though it conforms to Euclidean geometry. The analogy often given is, imagine that you were born with a blue lens actually built into the structure of your eyeball. Then you would see everything as though it's blue. It's not as though reality is actually blue. Your eye is just so structured that you can't help but see everything is blue.
Well, reality's not the color anyways.
Just an analogy. Now imagine that all human beings had that same exact eye structure. Then all human beings would agree that everything's blue. And there we go. We would all agree that universally we live in a blue universe. So this is what Immanuel Kant thought was happening, but for the structure of your mind. All human beings have this Euclidean geometry lens built into the structure of your mind. And so you can't help but experience reality as though it conforms to Euclidean geometry. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We can't know anything about reality. All we can know is how the structure of our mind allows us to perceive reality. Okay, so what does it? Aristotle disagrees with that. Here's what Aristotle says. Of course, Aristotle comes way before Immanuel Kant.
Right.
So he wasn't really arguing against Immanuel Kant, he was just explaining. So what must the nature of the mind be? The passive part of the mind can have no pre-existing structure of its own. Can't have any of these lenses built into it. If the human mind had prior structure, and since all information must be understood by the human mind, then the prior structure of the human mind would dictate our perceptions and conclusions. If we had the blue lens built into our mind, we can only accept blue, everything's blue. If we had Euclidean geometry built into our mind, we could only ever accept Euclidean geometry. Sorry, Gauss, hyperbolic geometry, we can't accept it. Sorry, Riemannian geometries, we can't accept it. Our minds are just so constituted that we can't do that. Now, they came after Immanuel Kant, so we didn't know he was wrong. So, that's what we're saying here. So, if the human mind had prior structure, and since all information must be understood by the human mind, then the prior structure of the human mind would dictate our perceptions and conclusions. We'd be forced to say, in reference to some perceived fact, that it may be true for humans, but we have to think that due to the structure of our own minds. We can never say this is the case. All we can say is, well, we can't help but accept that this is the case due to our human mind structure. And so, in other words, it disconnects our conclusions about reality from reality itself. All our conclusions then are just about the structure of our own mind, and we can't ever know anything about reality. So, it's often said that Immanuel Kant separated reason from reality, which he did. And all postmodernism pretty much starts with that premise going forward. This then undercuts itself. If the mind has structure, then we cannot know for sure that the mind has structure. All we can say is our mind is so structured as to make us think that our mind has structure.
Does that mean that it can't have structure?
No. It just means that the argument undercuts itself.
That it assumes that it's true.
If you're going to prove something, we got to get some rules to start the proof. And so you don't get to say it proves it. Common examples of things that undercut themselves. Someone says, all truth is subjective. Is that objectively true, that all truth is subjective? That's what they're saying. And so it instantly undercuts itself.
Right, okay.
So there's an example of an argument that undercuts itself. Or another one, someone might say, what if logic doesn't work? What are they asking? They're asking, what are the logical implications of logic not working?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's why Aristotle thinks that this passive part of our mind cannot have any pre-existing structure, and that it just passively takes in the forms that we see. That's all it can do. And so the forms that we take in are forms out there in reality. And we are being informed about reality as we form concepts. So, might seem like a weird technical point to focus so much on the passive part of our mind has no structure, but it's kind of crucial for understanding that.
Does the active part of our mind have structure?
The active part of our mind can have structure. It's how it starts reasoning about things.
So logic is the structure of the active mind.
Say that again?
Logic would be like a structure of the active mind.
Logic could be like the structure of the active mind. I don't know how I want to say it like that. I think when you're thinking about Aristotle, the best way to always think about logic is as metaphysical laws. And that everything, including the active mind, is subject to it. Okay. But any other questions about that?
What?
Go ahead.
What is an example of a structure the active mind could have?
So if he's going to make some argument about the active mind being immortal, for example, then that means it's got some structure that persists. That's why it would be the immortal part of you. Somehow, so for the active mind, this is somehow it's also the part of you, we haven't got to it yet, but the part of you that's endowed with agency and able to choose things. And that's somehow endowed in the active part of your mind. And so that's something it's embedded with. The ability to choose. The passive part of your mind, it can only take in forms. It can only be informed. That's all it can do. And so it is just blank slate, and you can put a form on it. Blank slate, put a form on it. Okay. So the passive part of the mind seems to be pure potentiality, and so capable of taking on any form. Now we're kind of in trouble here, Because we already talked about how there's no such thing as prime matter, which is what Aristotle talks about as pure potentiality. Completely formless matter.
Yeah.
And so here's one of the things that's hard to interpret, and unfortunately we just don't have a lot for what exactly he meant here. So he did not mean that, he talks about it as though it's pure potentiality, meaning it can take on any form, but he does not mean it in the sense of prime matter, because he's still thinking about the mind as being completely non-physical.
Oh, okay.
So it's a completely non-physical thing that is somehow pure potentiality in the sense that it can take on any form, but not in the sense that it's physical matter forming itself that way, but instead it's just that the mind is just a place where forms can exist.
That makes sense.
Okay, bit weird there.
Yeah.
Not talking about prime matter. And getting a better explanation than what I said, unfortunately, is hard because one of the places where what we have is sparse. So, since no potentiality can actualize itself, the mind also has an active part that is responsible for actualizing those potentialities. So the passive part of your brain takes in the form, the active part of your mind, sorry, I said brain. The passive part of your mind, not talking about something physical, the passive part of your mind takes in the forms. It's now the job of the active part to do something with those forms. Okay. And to actually use it to start constructing propositions and arguments and sciences, etc. The active part is the reasoning agency. It existed before the body and will persist beyond the death of the body. That's the immortal part of it. Now, we already talked about why Aristotle doesn't have much more to say about that. Remember, Aristotle is a philosopher focused on here and now. He's often referred to as a here and now philosopher. And so has very little to say about any sort of pre-existence or afterlife. He's just not focused on it. He's busy enough as it is, just describing the here and now. He's going to content himself with that. And this also gives you a good emphasis for his ethics. His ethics focuses on how to achieve happiness in this life. He's not trying to teach you how to have a happy existence, viewing you as some spirit in eternity. His ethics is going to argue for how you can have the happiest life here and now that you can have. And so, with that, next week we will move on and start with his ethics. And we'll end it there. Okay, any questions? I know that one was a bit of a technical one. Fortunately, ethics gets back to nice. Not bad for a guy just trying to figure out how it is we learn things. Especially focusing on the fact that he just wants to do the biology.
Yeah.
Good? All right.